in my continuing, I don't know, supposed moment to yet fight more people on the left because, well, I'm sorry, even if you are on the left and I see a stupid idea, I'm going to call it out. I really don't care. And to be honest, I've said this a lot of times. Ukraine has really exposed that there are a lot of people on the left, some people with deeply held beliefs about pacifism in one area. That's why I think a lot of Jeremy Corbyn's crazy ideas about his views on Ukraine come from. Um, there are a lot of people on the left really opposed to a lot of the stuff going on in Ukraine, that we shouldn't be supplying with weapons, and instead we should be trying to foster negotiations. And of course, there are multiple questions about this. So we're going to go over a piece today written by Andrew Murray, who is one of the people in the Stop the War coalition. So here's the thing. I want to reach out to sort of, Mr. Murray and go, hey, I'm someone on the left, but I am very sort of pro-Ukraine. And I am someone certainly prior to this didn't really care about NATO. But now this has made me very pro-NATO in this regard. So if anyone from Stop the War Coalition wants to come and genuinely have a conversation about this on my channel or wherever, on if you want to go on a neutral platform or whatever on your channel, I am fine to do that, because I will, again, this is something I will very happily defend this position on. I think there are lots of questions that people on the left refuse to even acknowledge the actual real political situation that is going on over there, and ignoring the past as well when it comes to a lot of these things. So we're going to go, oh dear me. So we're going to go into this today. This is from the Morning Star, which is a socialist newspaper in the UK. And they've published a piece about this called NATO, an aggressive alliance we must openly oppose. So let's go diving into this then. So, hang on, there we go. So, NATO, an aggressive alliance we must openly oppose. So, NATO is the name which must not be mentioned in British politics today. I think it gets mentioned all the time, to be honest, but there you go. At least in anything other than tones of utmost relevance. Again, I think that's completely ridiculous. I think you can have criticisms of NATO, but I think what we have really been seeing here is that this is being said that, and at least certainly trying to foster the idea that NATO is responsible for the war in Ukraine. It is absolutely 100% not responsible for the war in Ukraine at all. The people who are responsible for the war in Ukraine is Russia. It is Russia who decided to invade Ukraine. They're the ones who started this, going all the way back to 2014, where they fomented these rebellions in the Donbass, which, again, where they magically got things like heavy artillery from. Where did they get this heavy artillery from? Who knows? Magic. But there you go. Anyway, the 74-year-old military alliance has become a totem pole, which all are required to dance around. I don't really think so. But, you take that as you will. The real record is not examined. Its present purpose goes unscrutinized. It joins the royal family as an object of unquestioned bipartisan worship. I don't really think so. I do not really see it being worshipped. I think the guy who's written this article is very much trying to push the idea that NATO is responsible for the war in Ukraine. Over a year ago, Labour leader Keir Starmer effectively slapped a ban on any criticism of the alliance, even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine began. Again, please do provide proof of that, because I haven't seen that. Any Labour MP caught looking askance at, at NATO's contribution to the Ukraine crisis, risk losing the whip, hence their job for doing so. I'm guessing you're referring to the Stop the War Coalition letter. Well, we went over that back last year, and I'm sorry, what was being said in that Stop the War Coalition letter, which was some Labour MPs sort of initially signed up to and then backed off on because I think they realised, oh, actually, no, this letter is a bit ridiculous. Yeah, I'm sorry, it's a bit stupid. Like I say, and we'll probably get into those arguments in a bit. So even Tony Blair, at the height of the struggle over invading Iraq, a struggle which brought about 2 million people on the streets of London 20 years ago, did not resort to such authoritarian expendices. NATO was not involved in Iraq. Again, you're trying to bring something else which has no relevance to the current situation we are seeing in Ukraine to bring into Iraq. Iraq has nothing to do with what's going on in Ukraine. So Starmer joins Rishi Sunak and Johnson and Truss and before him in offering unqualified support to NATO's role. Yeah, in trying to help offer support to Ukraine and making sure that, these other countries that Russia could very easily use the justification it has used for invading Ukraine in many other countries, such as Finland. This is why they've wanted to join. The Baltic states, also Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, could very well easily be, invaded. There are a lot of former Soviet Union states that Russia could just say, "Oh no, that's ours. That's our historic clay. That's ours now." But there you go. So anyway, he joins other Labour right-wingers in coming over all misty-eyed at the memory of Labour's post-war Foreign Secretary, Ernie Bevin, an unabashed imperialist and anti-Semite for taking the lead in founding NATO. Who cares? He founded NATO. Good for him. I think NATO certainly proved why it was needed during the Cold War, certainly during those interwar periods. It certainly put off Stalin from pressing ahead with any sort of invasion of Berlin, taking Berlin fully. So did put off Khrushchev as well, his successor. NATO proved its mettle time and time again during the Cold War. But you continue, truth, however, will out. NATO was from the first an instrument of US hegemony in Europe, designed to lock the countries of Western Europe into Washington's orbit. That's not how NATO is set up. NATO is an alliance. Remember, France left NATO and then rejoined NATO later on. Yeah, you can say that all you want, but again, prove it. Prove how Washington has a monopoly over NATO and its member states. Prove how it can sort of dictate what NATO does. That's not the case. So, ostensibly directed at preventing a Soviet invasion, which in reality was never contemplated. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Multiple times Stalin did have plans drawn up for invasion of the West. Not only that, but Khrushchev did as well for invading the West. That's an unfortunate fact. That's not true that it was never contemplated. Again, trying to paint the Soviet Union as if it was just this land of peace and nothing bad ever happened in the Soviet Union, guys. Nothing bad ever happened. Just ignore anything that bad happened, Again, this is why tankies exist, unfortunately. So, it covertly planned to intervene against any state which looked like it might be coming to socialism. And again, yes, there was, of course, the Vietnam War, but I don't think NATO was overly involved in that. I think, obviously, the US was involved in that. Korea, I think, was NATO. I can't remember at the top of my head. But yeah, some of these, and again, succumbing to socialism. What about the Soviets' pressure that they put on some of those countries, um, and stuff that they fermented? Let's not talk about that, shall we? But hey, there you go. So, the end of the Cold War was the obvious moment to cart NATO off to the museum along with the dissolved Warsaw Pact. Except it wasn't, as we'll soon see. Instead, it was given a new expanded lease of life. No longer confined to Europe, its operations were spread worldwide, no longer even purportedly defensive. It instigated wars of aggression. Again, as these some of these wars that he'll talk about, not really started by NATO, but there you go. And no long, of course, no longer bound by promises made to the Soviet leadership when the USSR was dissolving. Um, Again, promises made to the USSR Soviet leadership, which again does not exist as a country. Those promises were never written down. Hence, those promises cannot be held to account for anything. Not only that, how does this writer think about the um, deal that the Soviets made, or at least the Russia made, when Ukraine gave up its nukes that it would not invade? That was a written down promise. Does the writer think that maybe Russia should be honoring that pact? Just a question for you there, guy. And of course, no longer bound to the promises made to the Soviet leadership when the USSR was dissolving, it extended eastward at pace onto former Soviet on the territory of the Soviet Union itself. These countries that joined NATO did so because they feared retaliation from Russia. That is why they joined. If you can't criticize NATO as per Starmer's edict, here are some of the things you may not discuss. Let's get on with discussing these, shall we? Because this is fun. So let's start with the Yugoslav War of 1999, which was waged without a pantia of international legality. The Belgrade government threatened no the NATO government the Belgrade government threatened no NATO member state, yet NATO was the instrument which bombed the country for months, targeting its civilian infrastructure brazenly. What went on during that? Let's talk about the mass genocide that happened, that was being perpetrated by the Belgrade government. You think that if NATO had not stepped in and not committed that bombing campaign, which brought about the end of that war, there would have been even more genocides happened in that country. That goes without a doubt. So this whole idea that they often use as, oh, the Yugoslav war, what do you think would have happened? The Yugoslav war would have just ended all quite nicely. Everyone would be handing out, rose petals and whatever. Bear in mind, at the moment, there are a lot of tensions in and around that area, and there's worry that, well, certainly Serbia, again, big supporter of Russia, might decide to kick off in a bit. There's a lot of tension in and around that area building up at the moment. So that is a worry point at the moment for a lot of people who look at foreign policy. So the 20-year occupation of Afghanistan was another NATO operation, although Afghanistan government and the people posed no threat to NATO. Harbored the Taliban government, massive fostering of terrorist organizations. Of course, 9/11. There were other operations that they carried out worldwide. Bit of a problem. And a generation of bloodshed and a destruction later, the neo-colonial occupation was brought to an ignominious end. What about the fact that now the Taliban has come back and is essentially reimposing their totalitarian regime on the country, even though we are seeing the people of Afghanistan protest against this and suffering violent repercussions against this? What does this person think that we should do to help those people in Afghanistan? Just a genuine question. What does he think we should do to help those people? So Libya in 2021 was menacing no one, except that's not the truth. This was part, of course, of the Arab Spring uprising. And of course, Gaddafi, who was again at the time in charge, gave up his nukes um, in response to the fact that he didn't think, he would be invaded anymore. But of course, there was worry that he may have a lot of chemical weapons and that if he um, was to get desperate, he may actually start using these chemical weapons. That was a serious concern at the time. And of course, he didn't, and he was removed. And unfortunately, that area is still very much of a mess. I will agree, Libya is a bit of a mess in this regard. But NATO, ultimately not responsible for it. I think there still needs to be a bit more of an international push to help really sort out more of the problems going on in Libya. And it's something that we should take responsibility for on an international stage. So, yeah, NATO was the force which imposed a regime change through bombardment. Um, uh, it wasn't through bombardment. Gaddafi was crushing these uprisings with violent repression. Just something you should probably mention um, there. And this is what I see when we get these types of anti-NATO stuff. They never really seem to acknowledge very often, as the case you've seen with these 3 points, the actual situation, what's going on the ground. Because if you start to talk about what's going on the ground in these situations, then all of a sudden their point sort of gets a little bit muted. So anyway, imposed regime change through bombing, shattering the country, plunging it into a cycle of devastation and immersion in division and immersion that persists to this day. And again, as I said just a few moments, I think the international community should take some responsibility and help try to end that a bit more. And of course, that might involve NATO. And of course, can't use NATO to help solve things like that, can we? So, all of these dreadful wars were directed towards a single point of sustaining global US power and the unipolar moment where all decisions of consequences around the world are made in Washington and Washington's interest, and those who dissented should be sanctioned by force if needs be. Um, Again, prove it. That's your say so. Prove it. I really do not see that with current NATO. Again, prove it. If you want to come talk to me, prove it. you know. So, and NATO was the vehicle for this project in all these cases. It is true that the Iraq War, again, why are you bringing the Iraq War into this? It's got nothing to do with Ukraine. And again, those are the 3 examples, nothing to do with Ukraine at all. But again, it would sort of ruin this guy's argument if he couldn't bring those things in, when again, this is meant to be about questioning NATO's role really in Ukraine. It is true that the Iraq War itself is still a greater crime than all these others. It was not a formal NATO operation, since the reluctance of France, Germany, and the other powers to oblige the US rendered the alliance almost impossible to mobilize. Interesting that in the previous sentence, this person has said that this was all meant to be get US power, and that this would be dictated to by Washington, and yet, oh, France and Germany didn't join in, and then the US couldn't mobilize the alliance. Some power structure there that apparently Washington has to manipulate all the world behind them, right? So, however, the war was primarily waged by NATO's 2 principal powers. Again, it wasn't a NATO operation. You just admitted it wasn't a NATO operation. The US and Britain, again, without any legal cover or indeed any justification whatsoever. I think there were justifications given for the Iraq War. Of course, you've got the chemical weapons, which again didn't turn out to be true. But also, needless to we forget that Saddam Hussein was a dictator. I mean, it's very likely if the Iraq War hadn't happened, maybe Saddam would have been toppled in the Arab Spring. Just like we saw the couple of other that destabilized a lot of the Middle East at that point. That may have been possible. So I don't know. We'll maybe never know. But yeah. But again, bringing in the Iraq War, again, doesn't really fulfill your argument about this. You're just wanting to bring this up. But so, what this litany should establish beyond argument, no, I certainly would disagree with you fundamentally about this, is the idea that NATO is a defensive alliance posing no considerable threat to anyone is ludicrous. Again, why did NATO step in a couple of those situations? What was the reason? You do not discuss that reason. I would say you not discussing that reason in itself and giving more context into those reasons why NATO was called into those arguments and situations ludicrous yourself. So there you go. And this is the fun part. One does not need to justify the policies of President Putin to understand that Russia might have well found the relentless expansion of NATO through Eastern Europe up to its borders menacing. Those countries joined because they were worried about the policies of Russia that stated that, we want to sort of retake and reconstitute, you know the true sort of motherland of Russia, which basically means imperial Russia, not just, of course, the Soviet Union territories as well. um yeah, you can absolutely look at the policies of Putin and Russia to say, yeah, this is why these countries joined NATO. They joined out of fear of retribution of what Russia might do. And what's going on in NATO is now justifying all their claims, because we've seen what's been going on in Moldova recently. So, what if, for example, let's say Russia succeeded in its Ukraine plan initially? Would have Moldova been next? Because by the looks of it, that certainly looks like what the plans were, leaked by the Belarusian president Lukashenko. We've had all the, oh, hey, there's been a potential Russian coup attempt potentially in Moldova. Once again, this is a complete abdication of the reality of the world that's going on and around them. Just be like, oh, don't worry, everything will be peaceful. If we don't do nothing, everyone will be peaceful. That's not how the world works, unfortunately. That's a bit of a fancy land. And unfortunately, this is the viewpoint of these people who I've said before. All that Ukraine has done is exposed a lot of people on the left for how bad they really are at foreign policy. So let's continue. The leaders of NATO, the Bush administration above all, again, why are you going back to this? Ignored Russia's concerns and offered NATO membership to Ukraine and ex-Soviet Georgia in 2008. This alliance was then active in supporting the overthrow of Ukraine's elected government in 2014. Oh no! These countries, Ukraine and again Georgia, they are sovereign countries. They have every right, if they want to join an alliance. Nothing should stop them. If their government and their people in that country want to join NATO, it's not up to you. It's up to the government. It's up to the people who vote for that government. And it was very clear that Ukraine wanted to join NATO. And now you're saying that apparently we were active in supporting in the overthrows of Ukraine's elected government in 2014. Do we need to list the numerous crimes that that government was up to in violently trying to brutalize the people of Ukraine at that moment, going back on its promises to move towards being a more part of like Europe and joining things with like the European Union and opening up to a more Western economy, where instead that government wanted to sign basically a economic deal that would have made Ukraine economically dependent on on Russia, would have forbid it from having its own economic domestic policy. And yet you wonder why people in 2014 might have overthrown that government. Again, serious question to this person. I would love to hear the answers to, and what evidence this guy has that again NATO was somehow involved in this overthrow, because there is no evidence at all for this. So between 2014 and 2022, the US and other NATO powers funneled weapons and other forms of military aid to Ukraine, rather than working to implement the Minsk agreements. We'll get to that in a moment, which were also designed to abate the conflict in the east of the country. So, first of all, Ukraine asked for that aid, and the US and NATO gave it to them. Ukraine asked, the US and the other NATO countries went, sure. Ukraine is a sovereign country. If it wants military aid from NATO or the US, it has every right to do so. Second of all, working to implement the Minsk agreements. Well, Russia didn't implement those Minsk agreements either. So why are you not mentioning the fact that they did not help to implement those Minsk agreements? For example, why weren't, again, the Ukrainian military forces at the time asking, we want to be able to secure those borders in and around those rebel areas to stop the flow of weapons coming in from Russia, which they knew 100% about. That's where all those rebels got all those guns from. Not only that, every moment Russia did everything it could not to fulfill these two Minsk agreements, which failed, which also poses the question of people wanting another ceasefire or another Minsk 3, as I suppose you maybe call it. What guarantee do you have that a Minsk 3 is going to work? And what exactly are you saying should be negotiated around this? Because at the moment, Russia's claims for what it wants to do to Ukraine are pretty crazy. So again, something other we should probably discuss if we ever end up having this discussion. So, and once Putin embarked on his unjustifiable adventure a year ago, I'm glad that you finally admit that, but there you go. It has doubled down on prolonging the conflict and escalating the supply of arms, tanks now, with fighter jets seemingly to come soon, has propped up the undemocratic Kyiv regime. Oh no. Since 2014, there have been three elections. Zelensky was elected. The idea that you would even call the Kyiv regime undemocratic is absolutely bonkers. And I would ask you to provide evidence as to why you think, even though there have been these, again, I think it's three, there might have been two elections since then, why those were undemocratic. I would ask you for evidence on that. So, Ukrainian forces are being trained by NATO military because, yes, they asked for that training. The US and British intelligence is being placed at Ukraine's disposal and is not disposal, and it would not prove in the least surprising if military personnel were on the ground helping to direct operations behind the scenes. Yeah, it wouldn't be surprising because Ukraine has asked for that. Certainly, the military aid, the intelligence aid. I very much doubt there are military personnel because Russia would have a field day if it could prove that. It is claimed many times, but there's no failed to provide any concrete proof. So, as far as we're concerned at the moment, there might be military personnel for all we know, but there's no proof that there is at this moment in time. And again, do please feel to provide, although you said it's, you wouldn't be surprised if there were. But of course, you would also have to say why, for example, during the pre invasion of Ukraine by Russia, why was Russia and its armed forces reporting loss of soldiers? What war was Russia involved in between the invasion of certainly Crimea, the fomenting of the rebellions in Donbass. Again, strange where all these weapons and stuff came from. Magic, isn't it? Anyway, Ukraine's defense minister recently boasted that his country is a de facto member of NATO already. Good, because it will stop any future invasion by Russia. And he appears to be right. And NATO's expansion is an accomplished fact. Overall, only missing the formalities. Yeah, exactly. It's only got the formalities. But but Ukraine wants to be a part of NATO so that Russia cannot just invade them again. Anyway, away from the synthetic Zelensky mania whipped up during the Ukraine's president visit to London, what NATO is all it's all about appears to be well understood around the world. While not backing the Russian invasion, the majority of the world has shown no interest in backing NATO's sanctions against Russia. Wrong. They have actually seen to be backing those sanctions. I think the world is pretty much agreed on backing those sanctions, nor in joining any campaign for diplomatic isolation. That is absolutely wrong. Russia has been very much diplomatically isolated on this. They have, and very quickly are becoming more and more pariahs on the world stage. So that is completely wrong in that assessment. The demand for immediate peace talks corresponds to the interest of the people across the world. What terms are you talking about? And not exactly what are these peace terms? Because you have to talk about what the Ukrainian peace plans are. So Zelensky put forward, I think, a 10-point peace plan, which, to be honest, I think is quite right, versus Russia's absolutely insane peace plans it would propose and it would want implemented. Namely, if were pretty much implemented, Ukraine would become an absolute puppet state of Russia. Do you think that's right? I mean, again, this is where we would have to have this conversation, and whoever would be justifying, whether it would be this guy who wrote this article, it would be completely unjustifiable, 100% unbelievable. It would be unbelievable to present him what Russia actually wants at the peace talks and ask him why Russia should just get all that at a peace talk. It would, you, again, so many on the left just are just so bad when it comes to this foreign policy stuff. I just don't understand why this. Why are they choosing to die on this hill? I just don't understand. But there you go. The delayed and continued conflict risks not just further death and destruction in Ukraine itself, but also a threat of escalation to even nuclear war. Who's threatening that nuclear war? It's not NATO, it's not Ukraine, it's Russia. And I think it's a bit disservice to say that it is not Russia that is threatening escalation to nuclear war, because they have been the ones threatening nuclear war consistently over this. So that priority demand must be the focus of the anti-war movement at this stage. The immediate issue is not Britain's withdrawal from NATO. Peace talks are now what the Stop the War coalition will be demanding on a protest on London on the 25th. Again, what structure these peace talks take? What exactly do you think should happen in these peace talks? Not only that, how do you explain, or at least how would you even contend with Russia's absolutely crazy demands it would make at these peace talks? Our focus will be on the British government, which has played a leading role in stamping out any flicker of hopes of negotiations and compromise over the last year, and will, with the Labour Party's full support. The West has done nothing to stamp out any negotiations or anything like that. To say that that is a thing is false. I'm sorry. That is not true. That is straight up not true. The idea that we have stamped out any negotiations or compromise is ludicrous because you've only just got to look at Russia's insane demands of what it wants to understand why the people of Ukraine, and you can see polling on this, they are willing to fight and they are willing to continue to fight to the end. So, looking beyond ending the present conflict, there will be no lasting peace in Eastern Europe until a new political architecture that can guarantee safety for all because it is under no one's domination. Well, NATO technically isn't under domination. I mean, you've already proved that with what you mentioned about Iraq, but there you go. And in that context, the issue is not just opposing the further expansion of the quote aggressive NATO alliance, but again moving towards its dissolution into those new security agreements. Well, again, what do those new security agreements actually look like? What do those mean? How would, for example, let's say NATO didn't exist and these new security agreements were in place? How would these security agreements meant to monitor or at least stop something like a very aggressive Russia from invading somewhere like Ukraine? How would these security agreements stop that from happening in the future? And of course, we are not supposed to talk about that right now, but the imperatives of history cannot be uh, gagged by the job's worth politicians. A big turnout on the 25th will tell them so, and it is the best way to remember the vast mobilization of 20 years ago. Um, I hope, to be honest, that February the 25th meeting, or at least protest, doesn't turn out to be very big. I don't expect it, to be honest, to be very big because I see most people on the left, most people understand where Ukraine's coming from. They understand their position, they understand where it's coming from. Um, I think what's been put forward by Andrew Murray, um, like say, hey guy, if you want to talk about this, you want to have a one-to-one, you want to have it on a neutral platform, whatever, we can do it on my channel, we can do it on yours, we can do it whenever. I will be more than happy to to talk with you. I would be more than happy to justify my positions and even ask you some of these questions about what you raised in your ridiculous things. Like, why is the Kiev regime undemocratic when it's already had 2 to 3 elections during this time period before the war started? Where's your evidence that there's been interference in that? And we would talk about, of course, Euromaidan, and I would be very, very happy to completely, absolutely destroy this person of what was going on in Ukraine in 2014. Um, this is absolute nonsense that's being put forward by this. But unfortunately, there are sections on the left that are like this that are absolutely awful when it comes to foreign policy, and I just generally can't believe how bad they are when it comes to discussing this type of stuff. But there you go. Um, so yeah, let me know if you want to have a conversation. Reach out to me. Let's start a conversation on this. I'd be very interested to have one, to say the least. It's a shame I can't go down to London on the 25th. But I'd be very interested to go down there. With God, if I had the money to get a crew together to go down and ask them these questions of the people involved, that would be interesting, to say the least. But anyway, as always, thank you very much for watching. It's been a long one today, so thank you very much for watching, and of course, we'll see you all next time.